The most misunderstood sentence an older man can say is this: "I don't want a girlfriend." People hear that and immediately assume something is broken. They think he is bitter, afraid, emotionally shut down, or stuck in the past. But most of the time, that is not what is happening at all. What they are hearing as rejection is often recognition. What they are calling loneliness is often clarity. By the time a man passes 60, he has usually lived long enough to know the difference between what looks good from the outside and what actually costs him peace on the inside. He has learned that companionship is not always comfort, attention is not always care, and closeness is not always safety. And once a man sees that clearly, he stops being impressed by the idea of a relationship just because other people still worship it. He begins asking a different question. Not, will this make me feel wanted? But, will this protect my peace, my energy, and the life I have left? That is where the real shift begins. Not in romance, not in resentment, in discernment. And that is exactly why so many senior men quietly arrive at a conclusion most people completely misread. People like Richard are often judged by people who have never had to protect what he had to rebuild. From the outside, his decision looks harsh. To him, it feels measured. He is not reacting to one woman, one bad season, or one disappointing experience. He is responding to a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Over the years, he learned that many relationships do not end because of one dramatic failure. They wear a man down in smaller ways. A little pressure here, a little guilt there, a constant need to explain himself, adjust his routine, manage somebody else's emotions, or carry expectations he never agreed to carry. None of that sounds serious when you describe it one piece at a time. But together, it creates a quiet kind of exhaustion. And at this stage of life, exhaustion is no longer a small price. Richard understands something many people do not. The older you get, the more expensive confusion becomes, the more precious calm becomes. So when he steps back, he is not stepping away from affection. He is stepping away from anything that turns connection into obligation. That is the difference most people miss. They think he is avoiding love. What he is really avoiding is the loss of himself. This is the point where the decision stops looking emotional and starts looking intelligent. Richard is not making a dramatic statement about women, romance, or modern life. He is making a private calculation about cost. That is what people rarely understand. At his age, every choice has sharper edges. Every new attachment asks for time, attention, patience, flexibility, and emotional room. And those things do not feel endless anymore. They feel finite. That changes everything. A younger man may still gamble with his peace because he believes there is always more time to recover. Richard no longer thinks that way. He knows that a few years can disappear faster than people expect. He knows that stress lingers longer, disappointment hits differently, and rebuilding his rhythm takes more energy than it once did. So he does not judge a relationship by how exciting it feels in the beginning. He judges it by what it will require from him over time. That is a very different lens. He is no longer asking whether someone is interesting, attractive, or fun to be around. He is asking whether her presence will make his life lighter or heavier. And for a man who has learned the price of heaviness, that question becomes everything. The first reason is simple, but most people still underestimate it. Richard no longer confuses being wanted with being valued. That distinction took him years to learn. When he was younger, attention could feel flattering. It could feel like proof that he still mattered, still had something to offer, still held a place in someone else's emotional world. But age strips illusion away. It teaches a man that not every form of closeness is built on respect. Sometimes it is built on convenience. Sometimes it is built on emotional hunger. Sometimes it is built on the quiet hope that he will become a source of stability, reassurance, structure, or relief. And that is where wisdom changes the lens. Richard does not hear interest the way he used to. He listens deeper. He watches for motive. He notices whether a woman is drawn to who he is or to what his presence can regulate inside her life. That is not cynicism. That is discernment. Because once a man understands that attention can come from need, just as easily as care, he stops treating it like a compliment by default. He becomes slower, calmer, and far less impressed. And that is often the moment he begins protecting himself from relationships that look warm on the surface, but quietly ask him to carry more than they give. The second reason is even more practical. Richard has become extremely protective of his energy. When people are young, They often spin themselves carelessly. They tolerate mixed signals, emotional inconsistency, unclear expectations, and long conversations that leave them more drained than understood. At that stage, many still believe that effort proves sincerity. But later in life, that idea starts to fall apart. Richard knows that energy is not a small thing anymore. It shapes his mornings, his health, his patience, his peace of mind, and the overall quality of the life he has left. That is why he pays close attention to how someone feels, not just in pleasant moments, but after repeated contact over time. Does her presence bring steadiness, or does it create tension? Does he feel more like himself around her, or more responsible for managing the emotional weather? These questions matter more than charm, more than chemistry, more than temporary excitement. Because a woman can be pleasant, attractive, and engaging, and still leave a man feeling subtly burdened. Richard has learned not to ignore that feeling. He no longer calls that sensitivity. He calls it information. And once a man starts trusting the cost his nervous system is measuring, he becomes much harder to pull into something that disturbs his inner balance. The third reason is where experience becomes almost impossible to argue with. Richard has seen how easily connection can turn into leverage. It rarely begins that way. In the beginning, it feels harmless. Someone wants more time, more reassurance, more emotional access, more influence over his choices. None of it looks dangerous at first because it arrives in small, reasonable pieces. But life teaches a man to watch what patterns grow into, not just how they begin. Richard understands that what appears to be closeness can slowly become pressure. What sounds like care can become expectation. What feels like devotion can become a quiet system of guilt, where saying no starts to carry emotional consequences. That is the shift he no longer ignores. He has learned that not every relationship asks for love in a clean way. Some ask for constant accommodation. Some ask for self-editing. Some ask a man to give up his rhythm, his preferences, and eventually his authority over his own life, all in the name of keeping harmony. Richard has no interest in that trait anymore. He is not against companionship. He is against subtle control disguised as emotional intimacy. And once a man recognizes that pattern, he stops calling it closeness and starts calling it what it is, a cost. The fourth reason is quieter, but in many ways it is the one that changes everything. Richard has stopped negotiating with discomfort just to keep someone else happy. Earlier in life, he might have called that patience. He might have called it maturity, compromise, or knowing how to make a relationship work. But age has a way of exposing the difference between healthy adjustment and slow self-abandonment. That is what he sees now with much more precision. He notices when he is expected to overlook what unsettles him, explain what should be obvious, or stay flexible in situations that repeatedly ask him to betray his own instincts. And he no longer treats that as a normal part of closeness. He treats it as a warning that something is already out of balance. This is what many people miss about older men like Richard. They are not harder to love because they ask for too much. They are harder to pull off center because they finally know what it costs to live disconnected from themselves. They have spent enough years carrying tension in silence, making room for what did not feel right, and calling it love because they did not have better language yet. Now they do. And once a man learns that peace requires honesty with himself, he stops making room for what quietly violates it. The fifth reason is the deepest one, because it is not really about refusing connection. It is about discovering that solitude now provides what relationships once promised. Richard did not arrive there overnight. He arrived there after years of learning what actually makes a life feel livable. Not intensity, not constant attention, not the comfort of being chosen. What matters now is something quieter and far more valuable. A clean home, a steady routine, the freedom to think clearly, the relief of not being pulled into emotional turbulence that he did not create. The older he gets, the more he realizes that peace is not empty. Peace is full. It holds dignity, rest, self-respect, and room to breathe. That is why being alone no longer feels like a lack to him. It feels like alignment. It feels like his life finally belongs to him again. And once a man reaches that point, companionship has to offer something real to compete with it. Not noise, not dependency, not the illusion of closeness. It has to bring ease without eroding freedom. It has to feel intentional, calm, and emotionally clean. Otherwise, solitude wins without a fight. And that may be the clearest sign of all that he is no longer choosing from emptiness. He is choosing from clarity. By now, the pattern is clear. A man like Richard is not walking away from connection because he has nothing left to feel. He is walking away because he finally understands what connection is supposed to protect, not destroy. That is the part people often miss. They assume a man who chooses distance must be damaged. But damage usually looks confused, impulsive, and unresolved. Richard is none of those things. He is calm. He is deliberate. He has simply reached an age where self-betrayal no longer feels romantic, and emotional strain no longer feels worth dressing up as companionship. He does not need the appearance of closeness if it comes at the expense of inner stability. He does not need to be admired, pursued, or emotionally occupied just to prove that his life still has meaning. He already knows its value, and that is why his conclusion feels so firm. Not because he has become cold, but because he has become clear. He has learned that peace is not a consolation prize for people who could not make love work. It is often the reward for finally seeing what love should never require. And once a man understands that, he stops chasing what disturbs him and starts honoring what protects him.